My name is Dante Morales, and I was a debt collector who made people pay what they owed. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged the world into an ice age, I thought my skills would keep me alive. I was wrong. Tracking down desperate people taught me to read human nature, but it also created enemies I never saw coming. In 30 days, I learned that survival isn't about staying alive. It's about staying human when everyone around you becomes a predator. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Let me tell you about the day the world froze to death. My name is Dante Morales, and for 12 years I made a living getting people to pay their debts. Not the friendly reminder calls or the polite letters that most collection agencies send out. I was what they called a closer. When someone owed money and had stopped answering their phone, stopped opening their mail, and basically disappeared from the system, that's when they sent me. My job was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. I tracked down people who didn't want to be found, looked them in the eye, and convinced them to pay what they owed. Sometimes that meant sitting in my van for hours outside their workplace. Sometimes it meant knocking on doors in neighborhoods where most people wouldn't feel safe walking alone. And sometimes it meant reading someone's desperation so clearly that I could predict exactly what they'd do next. The thing about desperation is that it makes people predictable. When someone owes $8,000 on a repossessed motorcycle, and they're 3 months behind on rent, they follow patterns. They avoid their usual hangouts. They park their car 2 blocks away from home. They send their kids to stay with relatives. They think they're being clever, but desperation has its own logic. And once you understand that logic, finding people becomes a science. I worked for Midwest Recovery Solutions, and my territory covered Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. In 12 years, I had an 87% collection rate on cases that other agents had given up on. The company called me their problem solver. My clients called me persistent. The people I tracked down called me a lot of things I won't repeat here. But here's what I learned in those 12 years that most people never figure out. Everyone has a pressure point. Everyone has something they value more than money. Find that thing, and you can get them to do almost anything. A single mom will pay her credit card debt to keep her kids from knowing she's broke. A small business owner will liquidate his savings to protect his reputation. A gambling addict will sell everything he owns rather than admit to his wife that he's lost their house. Reading people became second nature to me. I could walk into a room and within 5 minutes tell you who was lying, who was scared, who was angry, and who was about to break. I knew which neighbors would help someone hide and which ones would sell them out for $50. I understood how desperation changed people, how it made them make decisions they never thought they'd make. That skill set served me well in my profession. It was about to save my life. November 15th, 2025 started like any other Tuesday. I was parked outside a duplex on Maple Street in Akron, Ohio, drinking coffee from a thermos and watching the house where Marcus Webb supposedly lived. Marcus owed Midwest Recovery $8,347 on a Harley-Davidson that had been repossessed 6 months earlier. The bike was long gone, sold at auction, but Marcus still owed the difference between what the bank got for it and what he'd originally borrowed. Marcus had been dodging us for 4 months. He'd moved twice, changed his phone number 3 times, and even tried working under his middle name for a while. But people like Marcus always make the same mistake. They think changing their address means disappearing, but they never really leave their comfort zone. Marcus grew up in Akron. His ex-wife lived in Akron. His drinking buddies were in Akron. So when he thought he was hiding, he was really just moving around the same 20-square-mile area like a rat in a maze. I'd been watching the duplex for 3 days. The landlord, Mrs. Patterson, had confirmed that Marcus was renting the place, but he was clearly avoiding his own home. His car, a beat-up Chevy Silverado, hadn't been in the driveway once. The mail was piling up. The newspapers were still in plastic bags on the front step. But someone was living there. I could see lights go on and off at night, and twice I'd seen the curtains move when cars drove by. That told me Marcus was spooked. He was staying somewhere else, but checking on the place periodically. Probably sleeping at a friend's house or maybe in his truck. But eventually, he'd have to come back for something. People always do. Usually, it's something sentimental or something valuable they couldn't take with them when they ran. My van was equipped for long surveillance jobs. I had a small cooler, a portable battery pack for my electronics, blankets, and enough snacks to last a week. The windows were tinted dark enough that I could watch without being seen, and I'd positioned myself with a clear view of both the front door and the driveway. I'd done this hundreds of times before. At 2:47 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Emergency broadcast from the National Weather Service. That was unusual. I glanced at the screen and saw words that didn't make sense. Together, Yellowstone, supervolcano, eruption, evacuate immediately. I looked up from my phone and saw something that made my stomach drop. The western sky was turning black. Not storm cloud black, but a deep, unnatural darkness that seemed to be spreading like spilled ink across the horizon. I'd lived in Ohio my whole life. I'd seen tornadoes, thunderstorms, and blizzards. This was something else entirely. My phone started buzzing with more alerts. Emergency broadcasts from multiple agencies. The CDC, FEMA, the National Guard, all saying the same thing in different ways. Yellowstone had erupted. A massive ash cloud was spreading across the continent. Seek shelter immediately. Avoid breathing the ash. Expect significant temperature drops. I turned on my radio and caught the tail end of a news report. The reporter's voice was shaking as he read from what sounded like a prepared statement. The Yellowstone supervolcano, dormant for over 600,000 years, had experienced a catastrophic eruption at approximately 2:15 Pacific Time. The ash cloud was already covering parts of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. Preliminary estimates suggested the eruption was at least 10 times larger than Mount St. Helens. Then the reporter went off script. His voice cracked as he said that scientists were calling it an extinction-level event. The ash would block out the sun. For months, possibly years, crops would fail. Temperatures would drop globally. This wasn't just a natural disaster. This was the end of the world as we knew it. I looked at the duplex where Marcus Webb was hiding and realized that $8,000 didn't matter anymore. Nothing that had mattered an hour ago mattered now, but some things mattered more than ever. Like the fact that I was sitting in a van full of supplies. I knew how to track down resources, and I understood human nature better than most people. The ash started falling within an hour. At first, it looked like gray snow, drifting down in lazy flakes that coated my windshield. But it wasn't snow. It was volcanic ash, and it smelled like sulfur and burned metal. The smell seeped through my van's air filters and made my throat burn. I pulled a bandana over my nose and mouth and tried to think clearly about what came next. The radio was chaos. Reports of traffic accidents as the ash reduced visibility to almost zero. Airports shutting down across the Midwest. The power grid fluctuating as ash interfered with electrical equipment. And the temperature was dropping fast. It had been 58 degrees when I'd parked that morning. By 4 o'clock, it was 42 and falling. That's when my training kicked in. Not my debt collection training, but something deeper. The survival instinct that had kept me safe in dangerous neighborhoods and tense situations for 12 years. I needed shelter, supplies, and information. I had supplies in my van. Information was available on the radio for now. But shelter was a problem. I looked at the duplex again. Marcus Webb wasn't home, but someone was living there. The lights were on, and I could see a figure moving around inside. Probably a roommate. Or maybe Marcus's girlfriend. Under normal circumstances, I'd never consider breaking into someone's home. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I had a choice to make. Sleep in my van and hope the ash didn't clog the air intake, or find real shelter and deal with the consequences later. I chose shelter. The duplex had a simple lock that took me less than 2 minutes to pick. I'd learned the skill years ago, when I needed to repo cars, and I'd kept the tools in my van ever since. The front door opened into a small living room that smelled like cigarettes and microwaved food. The place was messy but not dirty. Couch, coffee table, big screen TV, pizza boxes stacked on the kitchen counter. This was definitely a guy's place. And probably not just Marcus's. I called out to let whoever was inside know I wasn't trying to sneak up on them. A man's voice answered from upstairs, asking who was there and what I wanted. I identified myself as a debt collector looking for Marcus Webb, which was technically true, and explained that I needed shelter from the ash. There was a long pause, then footsteps on the stairs. The man who came down was in his early 20s, thin, with the kind of nervous energy that told me he wasn't used to dealing with authority figures. He introduced himself as Danny, Marcus's roommate. He'd been watching the news and was just as scared as everyone else. When I offered to share my supplies in exchange for a place to wait out the crisis, he agreed immediately. Danny had been living with Marcus for 6 months, paying half the rent in cash and asking no questions about why Marcus never seemed to have a regular job. He didn't know about the debt or the repossessed motorcycle. As far as Danny was concerned, Marcus was just a guy who worked construction and liked to party. But Marcus had been gone for 3 days, and Danny was starting to worry that his roommate had skipped out on the rent. I didn't tell Danny the real reason I was looking for Marcus. Instead, I focused on the immediate problem. The ash was getting thicker, the temperature was still dropping, and the power grid was starting to fluctuate. We needed to prepare for a long siege. My van contained everything I'd learned to carry during 12 years of tracking people in unpredictable situations. Non-perishable food for a week, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, flashlights and batteries, a portable radio, basic tools, warm clothing, and most importantly, cash. Not credit cards or checks, but actual paper money. When systems break down, cash is the only currency that matters. By 6 o'clock that evening, the temperature had dropped to 32 degrees. The ash was falling so thick that I couldn't see across the street. The power had gone out twice, coming back on after a few minutes each time. The radio was reporting similar conditions across the entire Midwest. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, all buried under volcanic ash with temperatures dropping rapidly. Danny and I spent the evening reinforcing our shelter. We moved furniture to block the windows and reduce heat loss. We sealed the gaps around doors and windows to keep the ash out. We filled every container we could find with water in case the pipes froze. And we took inventory of what we had versus what we might need. The math was simple and terrifying. 2 people, food for maybe 10 days if we were careful, and winter weather that could last for months. The grocery stores would be emptied within days. The power grid wouldn't survive a week of this. And when people got desperate, they'd start looking for anyone who seemed to have supplies. That's when I realized my real advantage wasn't the food in my van or the cash in my wallet. It was the 12 years I'd spent studying human behavior under stress. I knew how people acted when they were cornered. I knew what they'd do to survive. And I knew how to predict their next move. Danny was a perfect example. He was scared, confused, and looking for someone to tell him what to do. Within 2 hours of meeting me, he was following my suggestions without question. He trusted me because I seemed calm and prepared. He didn't ask why I had so many supplies or how I knew so much about emergency preparedness. He just wanted someone to take charge so he didn't have to make decisions. But Danny was also holding back information. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact when I asked about Marcus. The way he changed the subject when I mentioned the rent situation. Danny knew more about Marcus's situation than he was letting on, and eventually, I'd need to know what that was. The radio news got worse as the night went on. The ash cloud was spreading faster than predicted. Temperatures were dropping below, freezing across the entire northern United States. Airports were closed indefinitely. Interstate highways were impassable. The president was scheduled to address the nation at 8 o'clock, but the broadcast kept getting delayed. When the president finally spoke, his message was brief and terrifying. The eruption was unprecedented in recorded history. The federal government was mobilizing all available resources, but citizens should prepare for extended disruptions to power, transportation, and communication. Everyone should shelter in place, conserve resources, and avoid unnecessary travel. What he didn't say was more important than what he did say. He didn't promise that help was coming. He didn't give a timeline for when things might return to normal. He didn't even pretend that the government had the situation under control. The subtext was clear: you're on your own. By midnight, the power had gone out and stayed out. The temperature inside the duplex was dropping toward freezing. Despite our efforts to insulate the place, Danny and I huddled around a small camping stove, sharing a can of soup and listening to the battery-powered radio. The news reports were getting more sporadic as radio stations lost power or abandoned their posts. But I was hearing something else on the radio that caught my attention. Scattered reports of people organizing into groups, neighbors helping neighbors, families taking in strangers, but also reports of break-ins, fights at grocery stores, and people hoarding supplies while others went without. The crisis was less than 12 hours old, and human nature was already showing itself. Some people were rising to the occasion, sharing what they had and helping others. But others were reverting to pure survival mode, taking what they needed and not worrying about anyone else. The question was which group would be stronger when the real shortage started. I thought about Marcus Webb, somewhere out there in the ash and cold. He'd been running from his debts for 4 months, sleeping in his truck or crashing with friends. Now he was probably trying to survive an ice age with whatever he could carry in his pockets. Part of me felt sorry for him. But another part of me wondered if his experience dodging creditors had actually prepared him for this better than most people. Danny fell asleep around 2 in the morning, wrapped in every blanket we could find. I stayed awake, listening to the radio and watching the windows for any sign of movement outside. The ash had stopped falling, but the wind was picking up, creating drifts against the houses like snow. The temperature was still dropping. That's when I heard the footsteps. Someone was walking around the outside of the house. Slow, careful steps that paused at each window. I turned off the radio and listened. The footsteps circled the entire duplex, then stopped at the front door. I heard the soft scrape of someone testing the doorknob. I woke Danny quietly and positioned us where we could see the front door without being seen from outside. The doorknob turned slowly, and I realized I'd forgotten to relock the door after bringing in supplies from my van. The door opened 6 inches, and a figure peered inside. It was Marcus Webb. He looked exactly like his photos, but thinner and more desperate. His clothes were covered in ash, and his hands were shaking from the cold. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, then stood there looking around his own living room like he'd never seen it before. Danny called out his name, and Marcus nearly jumped out of his skin. When he saw Danny, relief flooded his face. When he saw me, sitting in his living room with my camping stove and emergency supplies, his expression changed completely. Marcus Webb had come home to find a debt collector waiting for him in the middle of the apocalypse. The look on his face told me that $8,000 was the least of his problems now. But it also told me something else. Marcus had been expecting trouble. He'd been watching the house before coming inside. He knew someone might be looking, For him, I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible, and introduced myself. I explained that I was seeking shelter from the ash, that I'd been looking for him on a professional matter, but that the eruption had obviously changed everything. I offered to share my supplies and work together to survive the crisis. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating his options. He could throw me out and try to survive on his own. He could call the police, if the phones were working, and if the police were still responding to calls. Or he could accept my offer and deal with the debt situation later. But I could also see something else in his expression, recognition. Not just that I was a debt collector, but that I was someone who understood how the world really worked. Someone who knew how to find resources and make hard decisions. Someone who might be useful to have around when civilization started breaking down. Marcus chose to let me stay. But the way he looked at me when he shook my hand told me that he was already planning for the day when our temporary partnership would end. He was studying me the same way I'd been studying him for months, learning my weaknesses, figuring out my pressure points. I realized that my first enemy in this new world wasn't going to be the cold or the ash or the hunger. It was going to be the man whose life I'd been trying to ruin for the past 4 months. And he was going to be living in the same house with me for the foreseeable future. The next morning, we woke up to a world covered in 6 inches of ash mixed with snow. The temperature was 15 degrees below zero. The power was still out, and the radio was reporting that most of Ohio was in the same condition. But we were alive, we had shelter, and we had enough supplies to last several days. Marcus had brought news from the outside world. He'd spent the last 3 days moving between friends' houses, trying to stay ahead of what he thought were debt collectors looking for him. He'd seen the grocery stores empty out in hours. He'd watched fights break out over the last bags of ice at gas stations. He'd seen people abandoning their cars when the ash clogged their engines. But he'd also seen something that interested me. People were organizing. Neighbors were sharing resources and information. Someone in the warehouse district was collecting supplies and offering them to anyone who could contribute labor or skills. There were rumors of a group in the suburbs that had generators and was taking in families with children. The crisis was only 2 days old, but society was already reorganizing itself. The question was whether it would reorganize around cooperation or competition, around helping each other or exploiting each other. And I realized that my skills could be useful in either direction. That realization should have worried me more than it did. The next few days taught me that desperation doesn't take long to set in. By day 4, the temperature had dropped to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and it wasn't going back up. The ash had mixed with snow to create a gray slush that froze solid overnight, making the streets nearly impassable. Most importantly, the power grid had failed completely across our section of Akron. Marcus, Danny, and I had established an uneasy routine in the duplex. We took turns monitoring the radio for news, rationing our food supplies, and keeping watch for other survivors who might be looking for shelter or supplies. The dynamic between Marcus and me was complicated. We both knew why I'd originally been looking for him, but we also both understood that the old world's problems didn't matter much when you were trying not to freeze to death. What mattered was that Marcus knew the neighborhood better than I did, and I had the supplies and planning skills that were keeping us alive. Danny served as a buffer between us, asking questions and making suggestions that kept us focused on survival instead of our previous relationship. But I could see Marcus watching me, studying how I made decisions and allocated resources. He was learning from me, and that should have been my first warning. On day 5, we had our first visitor. Mrs. Chun from next door knocked on our front door around noon, asking if we had any extra food. She was in her 70s, living alone since her husband died 2 years ago, and she'd run out of canned goods the day before. Her power had been out for 3 days, and she was burning furniture to stay warm. This was my first real test of how I'd handle the moral complexities of survival. I had enough food to help her, but sharing it meant less for us. In my debt collection days, I would have calculated the risks and benefits, figured out what helping her might cost me in the long run, and made a decision based on pure self-interest. But looking at Mrs. Chun, shivering in a coat that was too thin for the weather, I found myself thinking differently. I gave her 3 cans of soup and a package of crackers. Not enough to solve her problem, but enough to keep her alive for a few more days. Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Danny seemed relieved that we'd helped her. But I noticed that Marcus was taking notes on what supplies we had and how I decided to distribute them. Mrs. Chen was grateful, but she also brought information. She told us that the houses 2 blocks over had been broken into during the night. Someone was going through abandoned homes looking for supplies. She'd also heard that a group of people had taken over the elementary school on Oak Street, pooling their resources and taking in families who had nowhere else to go. After she left, Marcus asked me if I thought helping her was smart. He pointed out that now she knew we had supplies, and she might tell other people. He wasn't being cruel, just practical. But his question made me realize that I was going to have to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in this new world. That decision became more urgent over the next 2 days. More neighbors started showing up at our door. An elderly man from across the street who'd run out of his heart medication. A woman with 2 young children whose apartment had no heat. A teenage boy whose parents had left town before the eruption and hadn't made it back. Each person represented the same moral calculation. Help them and reduce our own chances of survival, or turn them away and preserve our resources. But I was also starting to see a pattern. The people who came to us weren't just desperate. They were also potential allies. The elderly man had been a mechanic and knew how to fix things. The woman was a nurse who could treat injuries and illnesses. The teenager was strong and could help with physical labor. I made the decision to help them, but with conditions. Anyone who wanted our assistance had to contribute something to the group. Skills, labor, information, or supplies. We weren't running a charity. We were building a survival community, and everyone had to pull their weight. Marcus seemed impressed by this approach. He started suggesting ways to organize the group more efficiently, how to assign tasks and rotate responsibilities. But I noticed he was also positioning himself as my second in command, making suggestions about who we should help and who we should turn away. He was using his knowledge of the neighborhood to identify which people might be useful and which ones might be problems. By day 7, we had 9 people living in the duplex in the house next door, which we'd taken over when Mrs. Chun invited us to combine resources. We'd established a system for sharing food, fuel, and information. We had people taking shifts to watch for threats and opportunities. We'd even started sending out small groups to scavenge for supplies in abandoned buildings, but we'd also attracted attention. Other survivor groups were forming throughout the neighborhood, and not all of them were friendly. There were reports of people being robbed at gunpoint for their food supplies, houses being invaded by groups who took everything and left the residents to freeze, and rumors of someone in the warehouse district who was organizing these raids and taking a cut of whatever was stolen. The radio news, when we could get it, wasn't encouraging. The ash cloud was larger than initially predicted and wasn't dissipating as quickly as scientists had hoped. Temperatures were continuing to drop across the northern hemisphere. Agricultural production had essentially stopped. The government was admitting that recovery would take years, not months. But the most disturbing news was about social breakdown. Reports of violence in major cities as food supplies ran out. Mass migrations of people fleeing areas where the infrastructure had completely collapsed. And the emergence of what the news reports called warlords, people who were using force to control resources and territory. I realized we were seeing the same thing on a smaller scale in our own neighborhood. The friendly cooperation of the first few days was giving way to more organized and predatory behavior. People were forming groups not just for mutual aid, but for mutual defense. And some groups were clearly more interested in taking from others than in producing for themselves. That's when I made my second major decision. I started teaching our group some of the psychological tactics I'd learned in debt collection. How to read people's intentions from their body language. How to identify when someone was lying or planning something. How to use intimidation without violence to discourage threats. How to gather information about other groups without revealing our own capabilities. Marcus was a quick student. He seemed to understand instinctively how to apply these techniques to our survival situation. He started questioning the people who came to us for help, trying to determine if they were genuine refugees or potential spies for other groups. He suggested ways to test people's loyalty and usefulness before fully accepting them into our community. Danny was less comfortable with these tactics, but he recognized their necessity. The woman with the 2 children, whose name was Sarah, was openly grateful for the protection these skills provided. The elderly mechanic, Frank, had seen enough of the world to understand that nice people didn't always survive dangerous times. But I started to notice something troubling. Marcus wasn't just learning my techniques. He was improving on them. He was finding ways to read people that I hadn't thought of. He was identifying weaknesses and pressure points more quickly than I could. And he was starting to make suggestions about how to use this information more aggressively. When a man came to our door claiming to be a refugee from the warehouse district, Marcus was the one who caught him in 3 different lies about his background. When a group of teenagers tried to break into our supply cache, Marcus was the one who figured out they were working for someone else and convinced them to tell us who. When we needed information about which houses in the neighborhood had been abandoned, Marcus organized a reconnaissance mission that gathered intelligence without alerting other groups to our activities. I should have been pleased that Marcus was contributing so effectively to our survival. Instead, I was starting to worry about what he was learning and how he might use it. The skills I was teaching him were powerful tools for understanding and influencing human behavior. In the right hands, they could help protect a community and resolve conflicts peacefully. In the wrong hands, they could be used to manipulate and exploit people who were already vulnerable. The turning point came on day 8. Sarah's teenage son, Gary, didn't come back from a supply run. He'd gone out with 2 other members of our group to check an abandoned grocery store 3 blocks away. The other 2 came back without him, reporting that they'd been ambushed by a larger group who'd taken Gary prisoner along with the supplies they'd found. This was our first real crisis as a community. We could write off the lost supplies, but we couldn't abandon Gary. Sarah was hysterical with worry, and the rest of the group was looking to me for leadership. But I realized I didn't have enough information to make a good decision. I needed to know who had taken Gary, how many of them there were, where they were based, and what they wanted. Marcus volunteered to gather intelligence. He pointed out that he'd lived in the neighborhood longer than any of us and knew places where he could observe other groups without being seen. He also suggested that he might be able to infiltrate the group that had taken Gary, since they wouldn't recognize him as being associated with us. I agreed to let him try, but I also realized I was putting a lot of trust in someone who had every reason to resent me. Marcus was risking his life to help rescue the son of a woman he'd known for 3 days, on behalf of a community led by the man who'd been trying to collect his debts. Either he'd genuinely committed to our group's survival, or he was planning something I couldn't see yet. Marcus left that evening and came back the next morning with disturbing news. The group that had taken Gary wasn't a random collection of desperate survivors. They were organized, well-supplied, and operating under someone's direction. They had taken over a warehouse complex about a mile away and were using it as a base for raids throughout the area. They weren't just looking for food and supplies. They were taking people. According to Marcus, they were forcing captives to work as scouts and laborers, using them to identify targets and carry out dangerous missions. Gary wasn't just a prisoner. He was being forced to help them plan raids against other survivor groups, including potentially our own. Marcus had also learned something else. The leader of this group was someone who understood psychological manipulation as well as I did. He was using a combination of fear, false promises, and small rewards to control his followers. He'd convinced them that cooperation with other groups was weakness, that the only way to survive was to take what they needed from people who were too weak to defend themselves. The description Marcus gave me of this leader's methods was uncomfortably familiar. He sounded like a debt collector who decided to use his skills for pure exploitation rather than legitimate business. Someone who understood people's weaknesses and pressure points and used that knowledge to control them completely. Marcus suggested that we needed to rescue Gary quickly before he was forced to reveal information about our group's resources and defenses. But he also warned me that a direct confrontation would be dangerous. The warehouse group was larger than ours, better armed, and positioned in a location that would be difficult to attack. Instead, Marcus proposed a more subtle approach. He thought he could get himself recruited into the warehouse group by pretending to be a refugee with useful skills. Once inside, he could locate Gary and find a way to free him without alerting the entire group. It was risky, but it was probably our best chance of getting Gary back alive. I agreed to the plan, but I also made a decision that I hoped I wouldn't regret. I decided to trust Marcus completely, not just with the mission to rescue Gary, but with information about our group's capabilities and resources. If he was going to infiltrate a group of predators, he needed to know everything about our strengths and weaknesses so he could protect us from the inside. That night, I told Marcus everything I knew about psychological manipulation, intimidation, and reading people under stress. I shared techniques I'd learned over 12 years of dealing with desperate people in difficult situations. I explained how to identify leaders and followers, how to exploit group dynamics, and how to turn people against each other without them realizing what was happening. Marcus absorbed this information like a sponge. He asked intelligent questions and made connections I hadn't expected. He understood not just the techniques themselves, but the underlying principles that made them work. By the time we finished talking, I realized I'd given him enough knowledge to manipulate our own group if he chose to. But I'd also realized something else. Marcus was naturally gifted at reading people and situations. The skills I was teaching him weren't creating new abilities. They were just giving him a framework to understand and use talents he already possessed. Whether the first taught him these techniques or not, he was going to figure them out eventually. The question was whether he'd use them to help our community or to exploit it. Marcus left the next morning to infiltrate the warehouse group. The rest of us spent the day preparing for the possibility that his mission would fail and we'd have to defend ourselves against a retaliatory attack. We reinforced our defenses, organized our supplies for a potential siege, and planned escape routes in case we had to abandon our position. But we also did something else. We talked about what kind of community we wanted to be. Sarah argued that we should focus on helping other survivors and building cooperative relationships with other groups. Frank thought we should concentrate on becoming self-sufficient and avoiding conflicts with anyone. Danny suggested we should try to establish trade relationships with other communities, exchanging resources and information for mutual benefit. I found myself thinking about the warehouse group Marcus had described. They'd chosen to survive by taking from others, using fear and violence to control resources and territory. It was effective in the short term, but it also made them enemies of everyone around them. Eventually, they'd run out of victims or face organized resistance from their targets. Our group had chosen a different path. We decided to survive by helping each other and building alliances with other communities. It was more difficult and required more trust, but it also created the possibility of building something better than what we'd lost. The question was whether our approach would be strong enough to survive contact with groups that had chosen the predatory path, and whether the people in our group, including myself, would stick to our principles when those principles were tested by real danger. Marcus returned that evening with news that changed everything. He'd successfully infiltrated the warehouse group and located Gary, but he'd also discovered something that made the rescue mission much more complicated. The leader of the warehouse group knew about our community. He knew about our resources, our defenses, and our members, and he was planning to raid us within the next 2 days. More disturbing, Marcus had recognized the warehouse group's leader. It was someone from the neighborhood, someone who'd been watching our group since we'd started taking in other survivors. Someone who'd been gathering information about us while pretending to be a harmless refugee. The elderly man who'd asked Mrs. Chun for food the day after she'd visited us. The one who'd seemed so grateful for the small amount of help we'd given him. The one who'd asked casual questions about how many people were in our group and what kinds of supplies we had. The one I'd turned away because I thought he was trying to take advantage of our generosity. His name was Robert Martinez, and he'd been planning this from the beginning. He'd identified our group as a target the moment we started helping other survivors. He'd been using our own compassion against us, gathering intelligence while pretending to be in need of help. Marcus had learned all this while pretending to be recruited into Martinez's organization. But he'd also learned something else. Martinez had been asking detailed questions about me specifically. He wanted to know about my background, my skills, and my role in the group's leadership. He seemed to know that I'd been a debt collector, and he was interested in how I'd adapted those skills to the survival situation. That night, as we planned our response to the threatened raid, I realized that I'd made a crucial mistake. I'd assumed that my professional skills would give me an advantage in the post-apocalyptic world. I'd been right about that. But I'd failed to consider that other people might have similar skills, or that they might use those skills in ways I wouldn't. Robert Martinez had been studying us the same way I'd once studied debtors. He'd identified our resources, our weaknesses, and our patterns of behavior. He'd figured out how to exploit our desire to help others, using it to gather information and position us for attack. And he'd done it so skillfully that we'd never suspected we were being manipulated. The next morning, we discovered that Gary had escaped from the warehouse during the night. But when he arrived at our door, he wasn't alone. He'd brought 2 other people with him, refugees from Martinez's group, who'd decided they didn't want to be part of a predatory organization. Their names were Lisa and Tom, and they had information that made our situation even more complicated. Martinez's group wasn't just planning to raid us for our supplies. They were planning to take our people. Anyone with useful skills would be forced to join their organization. Anyone who resisted would be left to freeze. But Lisa and Tom had also brought something else. A detailed map of the warehouse complex, information about Martinez's defenses and personnel, and most importantly, knowledge of his plans for expanding his operation throughout the neighborhood. Martinez wasn't just trying to survive the Ice Age. He was trying to build an empire based on exploitation and control. Our group was just his first target. If he succeeded with us, he'd move on to other communities, growing stronger with each victory until he controlled the entire area. That's when I made the decision. That would define everything that came next. We weren't just going to defend ourselves against Martinez's raid. We were going to take the fight to him. But we weren't going to use his methods. We were going to use mine. I spent the rest of that day planning not just a rescue mission, but a psychological operation. I was going to turn Martinez's own people against him, the same way he'd tried to turn our compassion against us. I was going to show him that understanding human nature was a weapon that could cut in more than one direction. But as I planned the operation, I realized I was crossing a line I'd never crossed before. I was going to use my psychological skills, not just to protect my community, but to actively destroy another person's organization. I was going to manipulate and exploit people's fears and loyalties for what I believed was a good cause. The question was whether there was really a difference between what I was planning to do and what Martinez had been doing all along, and whether I'd still be the same person when it was over. The betrayal came from the person I least expected. On day 10, I woke up to find that half our food supplies were missing, along with Gary, Sarah's son. The same Gary we'd risked everything to plan a rescue mission for. The same Gary who'd escaped from Martinez's warehouse and brought us intelligence about their operations. Sarah was hysterical. She'd checked Gary's room that morning and found it empty, along with his backpack and winter clothes. When we inventoried our supplies, we discovered that someone had systematically taken the most valuable items. Not just food, but medical supplies, batteries, and the extra radio we'd been saving for emergencies. At first, we thought Gary had been kidnapped again. Maybe Martinez had sent people to take him back, along with whatever they could steal. But then Marcus pointed out something that made my stomach drop. Gary knew exactly where we kept our supplies. He knew our security routines. He knew when people were on watch and when they weren't. And he'd left voluntarily, taking only things he could carry and nothing that would be immediately missed. Gary hadn't been rescued from Martinez's group. He'd been working for them all along. His escape had been staged to get him inside our defenses and gather intelligence about our resources and capabilities. The information he'd brought about the warehouse complex might have been accurate, but it was information Martinez was willing to sacrifice to achieve a larger goal. I should have seen it coming. In my debt collection days, I'd dealt with plenty of people who'd use their own family members to gain sympathy or deflect suspicion. I'd seen parents send their children to lie to creditors, spouses who'd pretend to be separated to hide assets, and relatives who'd collaborate to present false information about their financial situation. But I'd let my guard down because Gary was Sarah's son, and Sarah seemed genuinely grateful for our help. I'd assumed that family loyalty would override any other considerations. I'd forgotten that desperate people make desperate choices, and that desperation can justify almost any betrayal. Sarah claimed she'd had no idea what Gary was planning. She insisted that he'd been as much a victim as the rest of us, that Martinez must have threatened him or manipulated him into cooperating. But I could see the doubt in the other group members' faces. If Gary had been working for Martinez, how could Sarah not have known? And if she had known, what else might she be hiding? This was the moment when our little community started to fracture. Frank, the elderly mechanic, suggested that we should throw Sarah out immediately. If we couldn't trust her son, we couldn't trust her. Danny argued that we needed to give Sarah a chance to prove her loyalty. Lisa and Tom, the refugees from Martinez's group, pointed out that this was exactly the kind of paranoia and suspicion that Martinez used to control his people. But Marcus had a different perspective. He suggested that Gary's betrayal might actually be an opportunity. If Gary was reporting back to Martinez, we could use him to feed false information to our enemies. We could make Martinez think we were weaker or stronger than we actually were, depending on what would benefit us most. The problem with Marcus's plan was that it required us to trust Sarah to help us deceive her own son. And it required Gary to believe that we didn't know he was a spy. Given that we'd already confronted Sarah about the missing supplies, both of those conditions were probably impossible to meet. But Marcus's suggestion revealed something about how his thinking had evolved since the eruption. He wasn't just learning my techniques for reading and influencing people. He was developing his own approaches to psychological manipulation. And some of those approaches were more ruthless than anything I'd ever considered. I made the decision to confront Sarah directly. I told her that we knew Gary was working for Martinez, and that we needed her to choose between her son and our community. I explained that we couldn't afford to have a spy in our group, but that we also couldn't afford to lose her medical skills. I offered her a deal. Help us feed false information to Gary, and she could stay. Refuse to cooperate, and she'd have to leave immediately. Sarah broke down and admitted that she'd known Gary was in contact with Martinez. She claimed that Martinez had threatened to kill Gary if she didn't provide information about our group. She'd been trying to give Martinez enough intelligence to keep Gary safe without betraying anything that would seriously damage our security. But when I pressed her for details, her story fell apart. She couldn't explain why Gary had taken supplies if he was just gathering information. She couldn't explain why she hadn't warned us about Martinez's plans as she was trying to protect both Gary and our group. And she couldn't explain why she'd continued the deception even after Gary had supposedly escaped. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. Sarah had been working with Gary from the beginning. They joined our group specifically to gather intelligence for Martinez. Sarah's medical skills were real, and she'd genuinely helped injured members of our community. But her primary loyalty had always been to her son and to their arrangement with Martinez. I should have been angry, but instead I found myself impressed by the sophistication of Martinez's operation. He wasn't just running a gang of raiders. He was running an intelligence network that used people's natural sympathies against them. He'd identified the exact combination of skills and vulnerabilities that would make Sarah and Gary valuable assets, and he'd positioned them perfectly to exploit our community's desire to help refugees. This was the level of psychological manipulation I'd only seen in the most sophisticated debt collection operations. Martinez understood not just individual psychology, but group dynamics and social engineering. He was using the same principles that marketing companies and political organizations use to influence large populations. The question was where he'd learned these skills. Most people didn't develop this level of sophisticated manipulation naturally. They learned it through professional training or extensive experience in fields that required understanding and influencing human behavior. Martinez might have been a salesman, a manager, a therapist, or even a debt collector like me. I made the decision to exile Sarah and put the word out that Gary was no longer welcome in our community. But I also made a more difficult decision. I was going to find out exactly who Martinez was and where he'd learned his skills. Because if he was using professional-level psychological manipulation to build his organization, I needed to understand his methods well enough to counter them. Marcus volunteered to gather intelligence about Martinez's background. He pointed out that he'd already established credibility with Martinez's group during his infiltration mission, and that he might be able to approach them again without raising suspicion. But I was starting to worry about how comfortable Marcus was becoming with deception and manipulation. Over the past week, I'd watched Marcus evolve from a desperate debtor hiding from creditors into someone who seemed to enjoy psychological warfare. He was good at it, possibly better than I was, and he was clearly energized by the intellectual challenge of outmaneuvering our enemies. But he was also becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize. The Marcus I'd been tracking for 4 months had been avoiding responsibility and trying to escape consequences. The Marcus who was volunteering for dangerous intelligence missions was actively seeking confrontation and taking calculated risks. Either the crisis had revealed aspects of his personality that hadn't been apparent before, or the crisis had changed him into someone fundamentally different. I decided to send Marcus back to gather information about Martinez, but I also decided to do some intelligence gathering of my own. I started reaching out to other survivor groups in the area, using the radio network that had developed among the various communities. I wanted to know if anyone else had encountered Martinez's organization and what they might know about his background and methods. What I learned was disturbing. Martinez's group had been active since the first week after the eruption. They'd started small, taking supplies from abandoned houses and offering protection to isolated survivors. But they'd grown quickly by recruiting people with useful skills and eliminating communities that refused to cooperate with them. 3 different survivor groups reported losing members to Martinez's organization. Not killed, but recruited through a combination of promises and threats. Martinez would identify the most capable people in a community, offer them better living conditions and more security, and gradually convince them to abandon their original groups. He was building his organization by cherry-picking the most valuable people from other communities. But I also learned something else. Martinez had been asking questions about me specifically. He'd been telling people that there was a debt collector in the area who was organizing survivor communities, and that this person represented a threat to independent groups. He was positioning me as an enemy before I'd even met him. That suggested Martinez knew more about my background than he should have. Either Gary and Sarah had provided more detailed intelligence than I'd realized, or Martinez had other sources of information about my professional history. Given the level of organization his group had demonstrated, it was possible he'd been planning this confrontation for longer than I'd thought. Marcus returned from his intelligence mission with news that confirmed my worst suspicions. Martinez had indeed been researching my background, and he'd been planning to target our community since we'd first started helping other survivors. But Martinez's interest in me wasn't just professional, it was personal. Marcus had managed to get close enough to Martinez to overhear conversations about our community. Martinez had referred to me by name, and he'd mentioned specific details about my debt collection career that weren't publicly available. He knew about cases I'd worked on, techniques I'd used, and even complaints that had been filed against me by people who'd felt harassed or intimidated. The only way Martinez could have known these details was if he'd either worked in the debt collection industry himself, or if he'd been one of my targets. Marcus hadn't been able to determine which, but he'd gathered enough information to suggest that Martinez's hostility toward me was based on more than just territorial competition. Marcus had also learned about Martinez's plans for our community. The raid we'd been expecting was just the first phase of a larger operation. Martinez intended to capture our most useful members, eliminate anyone who might organize resistance, and use our resources to support an expansion into other parts of the neighborhood. He wasn't just trying to survive the Ice Age. He was trying to build a permanent power base. But the most disturbing information Marcus had gathered was about Martinez's recruitment methods. He wasn't just offering people better living conditions. He was using detailed psychological profiles to identify their weaknesses and pressure points, then exploiting those vulnerabilities to ensure loyalty. He was essentially running a cult that used survival needs to justify absolute obedience. The techniques Marcus described were sophisticated enough to have been developed by someone with professional training in psychology or social manipulation. Martinez wasn't just naturally gifted at reading people. He was using systematic methods to analyze and control human behavior. And he was training his followers to use the same techniques on potential recruits. That night, I made a decision that would have consequences I couldn't predict. Instead of waiting for Martinez to attack us, I was going to attack him first. But I wasn't going to use violence. I was going to use the same psychological techniques he was using, turned against his own organization. My plan was based on a principle I'd learned in debt collection. Every organization, no matter how tightly controlled, has internal contradictions and competing loyalties. The key to breaking up a group is to identify those contradictions and exploit them until the group tears itself apart. Martinez's organization was held together by a combination of fear, false promises, and shared resources. His followers stayed loyal because they believed he was protecting them from external threats and providing them with security they couldn't find elsewhere. But that loyalty was conditional. If his followers started to believe that Martinez was a greater threat to their survival than the external dangers he claimed to protect them from, the organization would collapse. I spent the next 2 days developing psychological profiles of Martinez's key followers, based on information Marcus had gathered during his infiltration. I identified their motivations, their fears, and their relationships with each other. I looked for people who might be having doubts about Martinez's leadership, people who had skills that made them valuable but also gave them alternatives, and people whose loyalty was based on circumstances that might change. The plan I developed was complex and risky. I would approach Martinez's followers individually, using different tactics for each person based on their psychological profile. Some would be offered alternatives to Martinez's organization. Others would be given information that would make them question Martinez's honesty or competence. Still others would be manipulated into conflicts with each other that would weaken the organization's internal cohesion. But the most important part of the plan involved Martinez himself. I was going to arrange a direct confrontation where I could use everything I knew about psychology and intimidation to undermine his authority in front of his followers. I was going to force him to reveal the weaknesses and contradictions in contradictions. His leadership that his followers had been trained not to see. Marcus was enthusiastic about the plan, but he also suggested modifications that made me uncomfortable. He thought we should be more aggressive in exploiting people's weaknesses, more willing to use threats and intimidation to force compliance. He argued that Martinez's followers had chosen to join a predatory organization, and that they deserved whatever manipulation was necessary to defeat them. I realized that Marcus was starting to think like the enemy we were fighting. He was becoming comfortable with the idea that psychological manipulation was justified when used against people he considered threats. He was losing sight of the difference between using these techniques for protection and using them for exploitation. But I also realized that I didn't have many alternatives. Our community was small, poorly armed, and facing a larger organization that had been planning this confrontation for weeks. If I wanted to protect the people who depended on me, I was going to have to use every tool available, even if those tools made me uncomfortable. The operation began on day 14. I started by approaching 3 of Martinez's followers who Marcus had identified as potential defectors. These were people who had joined Martinez's organization for protection, but who had been disturbed by its increasingly predatory behavior. I offered them safe passage to other communities and protection from retaliation if they provided information about Martinez's plans and weaknesses. 2 of the 3 agreed to help, and the information they provided confirmed that Martinez was planning to attack our community within the next few days. But it also revealed something I hadn't expected. Martinez had been in contact with other predatory groups in the region, and he was planning to coordinate attacks on multiple survivor communities simultaneously. This wasn't just about territorial competition or resource acquisition. Martinez was trying to eliminate organized resistance to predatory behavior throughout the entire area. He was working to create a region where survival depended on either joining organizations like his or becoming their victims. That realization changed the stakes of our confrontation completely. We weren't just fighting for our own survival. We were fighting to determine what kind of society would emerge from the collapse of the old world. Would it be based on cooperation and mutual aid, or would it be based on exploitation and control? I decided to accelerate the timeline for our psychological operation. Instead of gradually undermining Martinez's organization over several weeks, I was going to try to destroy it in a single coordinated attack. But that meant taking risks that could backfire catastrophically if Martinez was better at psychological warfare than I thought he was. The direct confrontation I'd been planning was scheduled for day 17. Marcus had arranged for me to meet with Martinez under the pretense of negotiating a territorial agreement between our communities. Martinez had agreed to the meeting because he thought it would give him an opportunity to assess my capabilities and possibly recruit me to his organization. But I had learned something about Martinez that he didn't know I knew. One of his defectors had recognized him from before the eruption. Martinez wasn't just someone who had learned psychological manipulation professionally. He was someone I had encountered in my debt collection career. His real name was Robert Martinez, and 3 years ago, I had been assigned to collect a debt he owed on a failed business loan. I had tracked him down, confronted him about his attempts to hide assets, and used standard intimidation techniques to pressure him into setting up a payment plan. The case had been routine for me, but apparently it had been traumatic for him. Martinez had learned psychological manipulation by being subjected to it. He had studied my techniques not because he was naturally gifted at reading people, but because he had been forced to understand them in order to protect himself. He had built his entire post-apocalyptic organization around the principle that it was better to be the predator than the prey. And now he was going to find out that his teacher was still in the game. The meeting was set for day 17 at an abandoned gas station halfway between our territory and Martinez's warehouse complex. I arrived early, positioning myself where I could observe the approaches and exits while appearing to wait casually for the negotiation to begin. This was a technique I'd learned in debt collection when meeting potentially hostile debtors in neutral locations. Always control the environment, even when you're pretending to be cooperative. Martinez arrived exactly on time with 2 bodyguards, which told me several things about his operational style. He was punctual, which meant he respected schedules and planning. He brought backup, which meant he didn't trust me, but wasn't so paranoid that he brought an army. And he chose bodyguards who looked competent but not threatening, which meant he wanted to project strength without appearing aggressive. The moment I saw Martinez's face, 3 years of memories came flooding back. Robert Martinez, 42 years old, divorced, owner of a failed auto repair shop in Cleveland. He'd borrowed $60,000 to expand his business, then defaulted when a larger chain moved in next door and stole most of his customers. When I'd been assigned to collect the debt, he'd already lost his shop, his house, and his marriage. But the Robert Martinez who'd been a broken man hiding from creditors was gone. This Martinez carried himself with confidence and authority. He'd gained weight, suggesting regular meals and reduced stress. His clothes were clean and well maintained. Most importantly, his body language projected control and competence. He'd transformed himself from a victim into a predator. Martinez recognized me immediately, but his reaction wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of anger or fear, he smiled. He dismissed his bodyguards with a casual wave and approached me like we were old friends meeting for coffee. His opening words caught me completely off guard. He thanked me for teaching him everything he needed to know about human psychology. He explained that our encounters 3 years ago had been educational experiences that prepared him for leadership in the post-apocalyptic world. He said that watching me work had shown him how to identify people's weaknesses, exploit their fears, and manipulate their behavior to achieve specific goals. According to Martinez, I had been an excellent teacher, even though I hadn't intended to be one. Every technique I'd used to pressure him into paying his debt had been carefully studied and adapted for his current organization. The way I'd tracked him down had taught him how to gather intelligence. The way I'd read his emotional state had taught him how to assess potential recruits. The way I'd applied psychological pressure had taught him how to maintain control over his followers. Martinez told me that he'd built his entire survival strategy around lessons learned from being collected. He'd realized that the post-apocalyptic world would belong to people who understood psychology and manipulation, and that his experience as my target had given him insights that most survivors lacked. He wasn't angry about our previous relationship. He was grateful for it. This conversation was deeply unsettling, but it was also revealing. Martinez was trying to establish psychological dominance by reframing our past relationship as voluntary mentorship rather than predatory collection. He was suggesting that he was now my equal, possibly my superior, in the field of psychological manipulation. And he was implying that any conflict between us would be a contest between former teacher and successful student. But Martinez was also revealing crucial information about his mindset and motivations. He saw the post-apocalyptic world as an opportunity to apply lessons learned from being victimized. He believed that survival required becoming a predator, and that anyone who refused to embrace that reality was weak and doomed to failure. Most importantly, he thought that our shared background in psychological manipulation made us natural allies rather than enemies. Martinez proposed a partnership between our organizations. He suggested that we could divide the territory, coordinate our operations, and share intelligence about other survivor groups. He argued that cooperation between people who understood psychology would be more effective than competition, and that together we could control a much larger area than either of us could manage alone. The proposal was tempting from a purely practical standpoint. Martinez's organization was larger and better established than ours. An alliance would provide security and resources that we couldn't obtain on our own. And Martinez was clearly skilled at psychological manipulation, which meant he could be a valuable partner in dealing with other threats. But Martinez's proposal also revealed the fundamental difference between us. He saw psychological manipulation as a tool for exploitation and control. I had learned to see it as a tool for protection and community building. He wanted to use our skills to dominate other survivors. I wanted to use mine to help them organize and defend themselves. I declined Martinez's offer, but I did it in a way that left the door open for future negotiations. I told him that I needed time to consider his proposal and discuss it with my community. I suggested that we could meet again in a few days to continue the conversation. I wanted him to believe that I was genuinely considering partnership while I prepared for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. Martinez seemed pleased with my response. He interpreted my request for time as evidence that I was taking his proposal seriously. He agreed to postpone any aggressive actions against our community while negotiations were ongoing. He even offered to share intelligence about other threats in the area as a gesture of good faith. As we prepared to leave the meeting, Martinez made one final comment that changed everything. He mentioned that he'd been in contact with other like-minded individuals throughout the region, people who understood that survival required strong leadership and decisive action. He suggested that our partnership could be part of a larger network of communities organized around similar principles. This wasn't just about territorial control or resource acquisition. Martinez was part of a coordinated effort to establish a new social order based on psychological manipulation and exploitation. He was trying to build a network of predatory communities that would dominate the post-apocalyptic landscape, and he wanted me to help him do it. I returned to our community with a much clearer understanding of what we were facing. Martinez wasn't just a local threat. He was part of a larger movement that could reshape the entire region. If his network succeeded, cooperation and mutual aid would become impossible. Survivors would be forced to choose between joining predatory organizations or becoming their victims. That night, I called a meeting of our entire community to discuss the situation. I explained Martinez's proposal, the threat his network represented, and the choice we faced. We could try to coexist with predatory organizations by avoiding conflict and hoping they'd leave us alone. We could attempt to join Martinez's network and hope we could influence it from within. Or we could actively resist and try to organize other communities to oppose the predatory model. The discussion that followed revealed deep divisions within our group. Frank, the elderly mechanic, argued for avoiding conflict at all costs. He pointed out that we were outnumbered and outgunned, and that resistance would likely result in our destruction. Danny suggested that we should try to negotiate a more favorable arrangement with Martinez, possibly offering limited cooperation in exchange for autonomy. But Lisa and Tom, the refugees from Martinez's organization, provided a different perspective. They explained that Martinez's model was unsustainable in the long term because it required constant expansion and increasingly desperate measures to maintain control. They argued that resistance was inevitable and that organizing it sooner rather than later would give us better chances of success. Marcus had the most interesting take on the situation. He suggested that we should pretend to accept Martinez's partnership offer while secretly working to undermine his organization from within. He argued that our knowledge of psychological manipulation gave us tools to turn Martinez's followers against him, and that we should use those tools aggressively to destroy the threat before it could grow stronger. Marcus's suggestion revealed how much his thinking had evolved since the beginning of the crisis. He was no longer just learning my techniques. He was developing strategic applications that went beyond anything I'd ever considered. But he was also becoming comfortable with levels of deception and manipulation that made me uncomfortable. I made the decision to implement a modified version of Marcus's plan. We would pretend to negotiate with Martinez while secretly preparing for confrontation. But instead of trying to infiltrate and destroy his organization directly, we would focus on building alliances with other survivor communities and organizing coordinated resistance to the predatory model. Over the next 3 days, I used the radio network to contact every survivor group in the region. I shared information about Martinez's network and explained the threat it represented to independent communities. I offered to coordinate defensive measures and share intelligence about predatory operations. Most importantly, I tried to identify communities that had the skills and resources to resist effectively. The response was mixed but encouraging. Several communities reported encounters with Martinez's network or similar predatory groups. Most were interested in coordinating defensive measures, but they were also skeptical about our ability to organize effective resistance. Many survivor groups were barely managing to feed and shelter their own members, and they didn't have resources to spare for regional conflicts. But I also discovered something hopeful. Martinez's network wasn't as large or well organized as he'd claimed. Several communities reported successful resistance to predatory raids, and at least 2 predatory groups had been eliminated by coordinated action from their intended victims. The predatory model wasn't invincible, and organized resistance could be effective. More importantly, I learned that Martinez had been exaggerating his success and influence to intimidate potential opponents. His organization controlled fewer resources than he'd claimed, and his alliances with other predatory groups were more tenuous than he'd suggested. He was using psychological manipulation not just to control his followers, but to project an image of strength that might not reflect reality. On day 20, Martinez requested another meeting to discuss the terms of our partnership. I agreed, but this time I brought Marcus with me as an advisor and witness. I wanted Martinez to see that our community was united behind whatever decision I made, and I wanted Marcus to observe Martinez's techniques firsthand. The second meeting took place at the same abandoned gas station, but the dynamics were completely different. Martinez arrived with 4 bodyguards instead of 2, suggesting increased paranoia or preparation for violence. He was less friendly and more businesslike, indicating that he was losing patience with the negotiation process. Most importantly, he seemed more interested in assessing our capabilities than in discussing partnership terms. Martinez opened the meeting by pressuring me for a decision about his partnership offer. He pointed out that his organization was growing stronger every day, while mine remained small and vulnerable. He suggested that delaying the decision was actually a decision to choose conflict over cooperation. He was using standard sales pressure techniques to force a commitment before I was ready to make one. But Martinez also revealed new information about his network's plans. He mentioned upcoming operations against several communities I'd been in contact with through the radio network. He described these operations as recruitment efforts, but the details he provided made it clear that they were planned raids, designed to eliminate resistance and capture resources. Martinez was telling me about these plans for a specific psychological reason. He wanted me to understand that resistance was futile, that my attempts to organize other communities had already been detected and countered. He was trying to make me feel isolated and hopeless, so that I'd accept his partnership offer out of desperation rather than conviction. The technique was effective, but it was also familiar. I'd used similar approaches in debt collection when dealing with people who were trying to avoid payment by organizing support from family members or legal advisors. The goal was to make them feel that their support network was ineffective and that cooperation was their only realistic option. But Martinez had made a crucial mistake. By revealing his plans against other communities, he'd given me information I could use to warn them and coordinate defensive measures. He'd also revealed that his intelligence about my activities was incomplete and possibly inaccurate. He knew I'd been contacting other communities, but he didn't know the full extent of the resistance network we'd been building. I told Martinez that I needed one more day to make a final decision about his partnership offer. I explained that my community was divided about the best course of action, and that I needed time to build consensus for whatever choice we made. I suggested that we meet the following evening to finalize our agreement. Martinez agreed to the delay, but he also made it clear that this was his final offer. He said that after tomorrow night, he would assume that any community that wasn't actively cooperating with his network was hostile to it. He would act accordingly. As Marcus and I returned to our community, I realized that Martinez had just declared war on every survivor group in the region. His ultimatum wasn't just directed at us. It was a general announcement that neutrality was no longer an option and that survival required choosing sides in a conflict between cooperation and exploitation. That night, I used a radio network to coordinate the largest operation I'd ever attempted. Instead of trying to infiltrate Martinez's organization or negotiate with his followers individually, I was going to organize a simultaneous attack on predatory groups throughout the region. Multiple communities would strike at the same time, eliminating the threat before it could become too large to handle. The plan required precise timing and coordination between groups that had never worked together before. It required communities to commit resources they could barely spare to an operation that might fail catastrophically. Most importantly, it required people to trust that cooperation could be more effective than the predatory model that seemed to offer more immediate security. But the plan also had one crucial advantage. Martinez and his network had built their entire strategy around psychological manipulation of isolated communities. They'd never faced coordinated resistance from multiple groups that were sharing intelligence and resources. Their techniques were designed to exploit desperation and isolation, but they weren't prepared for organized opposition. As I finalized the details of the operation, I realized that this would be the ultimate test of everything I'd learned about human psychology and group dynamics. We weren't just fighting for our own survival anymore. We were fighting to determine what kind of world would emerge from the collapse of the old one. The attack was scheduled for day 22, the morning after my final meeting with Martinez. By then, Martinez would know that I'd rejected his partnership offer, but he wouldn't have time to organize defenses against coordinated strikes on multiple targets. We would have one chance to eliminate the predatory network before it could adapt to the threat of organized resistance. Marcus volunteered to lead the assault on Martinez's warehouse complex, arguing that his knowledge of the facility's layout and defenses made him the obvious choice. But I was starting to worry about Marcus's enthusiasm for psychological warfare and violent confrontation. He seemed to be enjoying the intellectual challenge of outmaneuvering our enemies, and I was concerned about what that enjoyment might lead him to do when the stakes became life and death. But I also realized that Marcus had become our most effective operator in the field of psychological manipulation. He understood these techniques better than anyone else in our community, and he demonstrated the ability to think strategically about their application. If our plan was going to succeed, we needed his skills and experience. On the evening of day 21, I met Martinez for what I told him would be our final negotiation. But instead of giving him an answer about his partnership offer, I was going to give him a lesson about the difference between manipulation and leadership. I was going to show him that understanding human psychology could be used to build communities, rather than exploit them. And I was going to discover whether the student had actually surpassed the teacher, or whether there were still some lessons about human nature that Martinez needed to learn. The final meeting with Martinez took place on the evening of day 21, but I didn't go there to negotiate. I went there to end his organization before it could destroy every cooperative community in the region. What I didn't expect was to discover that Martinez had been planning the same thing for me. When I arrived at the abandoned gas station, Martinez was already waiting with 6 armed followers instead of his usual 2 bodyguards. They had positioned themselves to control all the exits and approaches, turning what was supposed to be a neutral meeting into a potential ambush. But Martinez himself seemed relaxed and confident, which told me that he believed he held all the advantages. Marcus had insisted on coming with me despite my concerns about his safety. He argued that we needed to present a united front and that his presence would demonstrate our community's commitment to whatever decision I made. But as we approached the meeting site, I realized that Marcus had his own agenda for being there. Martinez opened the conversation by congratulating me on the intelligence network I'd built over the past week. He revealed that his organization had been monitoring radio communications throughout the region, and that they'd identified most of the communities I'd been coordinating with. He knew about our planned resistance operation, and he'd already taken steps to counter it. According to Martinez, his network had grown much larger than I'd realized. While I'd been organizing defensive alliances, he'd been recruiting entire communities by offering them better terms than they could get through cooperation. He claimed that several groups I thought were allies had actually switched sides after receiving more attractive offers from his organization. Martinez then made me an offer that revealed the true scope of his operation. He didn't just want our community to join his network. He wanted me personally to become his second in command, using my psychological skills to help expand the organization throughout the state. He argued that my reputation and abilities made me too valuable to waste on a small cooperative community that couldn't survive the challenges ahead. The offer was simultaneously flattering and terrifying. Martinez was acknowledging that I was skilled enough to be a genuine threat to his plans, but he was also trying to neutralize that threat by converting me into an asset. He understood that defeating me through force or intimidation would be difficult, so he was trying to defeat me through temptation and logical argument. But Martinez's offer also revealed something about his strategic thinking that gave me hope. He was still thinking like a debt collector, focusing on individual targets and personal relationships rather than systems and networks. He thought that eliminating or converting key leaders would be enough to defeat organized resistance. He didn't understand that the communities I'd been working with had developed their own leadership and coordination capabilities. I rejected Martinez's offer, but I did it in a way that was designed to provoke him into revealing more information about his plans and capabilities. I suggested that his network was less stable than he claimed, and that many of his supposed allies were probably looking for opportunities to defect. I implied that his growth strategy was unsustainable because it required constant expansion and increasingly desperate measures to maintain loyalty. Martinez's reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. Instead of staying calm and confident, he became defensive and started providing details about his organization that he shouldn't have shared. He listed specific communities that had joined his network, described the terms of various alliance agreements, and explained his plans for dealing with remaining resistance groups. Most importantly, Martinez revealed that his organization was facing serious internal problems. Several key leaders were questioning his strategy and demanding more autonomy for their individual communities. Resource allocation was becoming a source of conflict as the network grew larger, and maintaining loyalty was requiring increasingly harsh measures against anyone who showed signs of disloyalty. But the most valuable information Martinez provided was about the timing of his planned operations. He intended to eliminate all remaining resistance groups within the next 3 days before they could coordinate effective defenses or build stronger alliances. He was planning simultaneous attacks on multiple targets using the same approach. I'd been organizing for our side. As Martinez spoke, I realized that Marcus was taking careful notes of everything being said. But Marcus wasn't just recording information for our own planning purposes. He was studying Martinez's techniques and strategies with the kind of intense focus that suggested professional interest rather than simple intelligence gathering. When Martinez finished explaining his plans, Marcus asked a question that surprised everyone present. He wanted to know how Martinez maintained discipline and loyalty within such a large and diverse organization. He seemed genuinely curious about the psychological techniques required to manage multiple communities with different cultures and priorities. Martinez was pleased to answer Marcus's question, apparently interpreting it as evidence that we were seriously considering his offer. He explained that successful leadership in the post-apocalyptic world required understanding each community's specific fears and desires, then positioning himself as the solution to their problems and the source of their security. According to Martinez, the key was to make people believe that their survival depended entirely on his organization's protection and resources. He achieved this by eliminating alternative sources of security, isolating communities from potential allies, and demonstrating the consequences of disloyalty through public examples. Fear was more effective than loyalty because it was more predictable and easier to maintain. As Martinez described his methods, I realized that Marcus was absorbing every detail with the kind of attention I'd only seen him give to subjects that fascinated him personally. Marcus wasn't just learning about Martinez's techniques for intelligence purposes. He was studying them because he found them intellectually compelling. That realization changed my understanding of everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks. Marcus hadn't just been learning my psychological manipulation techniques to help our community survive. He'd been developing his own approach to leadership and control, using our crisis as a laboratory for experimenting with different methods of influencing human behavior. Marcus had been playing a longer game than I'd realized. He'd been positioning himself not just as my assistant in managing our community, but as a potential leader who understood psychological manipulation better than anyone else in the group. He'd been studying both my methods and Martinez's methods, looking for ways to combine them into something more effective than either approach alone. When Martinez finished explaining his leadership philosophy, Marcus made a suggestion that caught everyone off guard. He proposed that our community should accept Martinez's partnership offer, but with modifications that would give us more autonomy and better terms than the standard arrangement. He argued that cooperation was more likely to achieve our survival goals than continued resistance. I stared at Marcus in shock, realizing that he'd been planning this betrayal for days or possibly weeks. He hadn't come to this meeting to support my negotiation strategy. He'd come to negotiate his own deal with Martinez, using information about our community and our resistance network as bargaining chips. But Marcus's betrayal also presented an opportunity I hadn't expected. If Martinez believed that our community was genuinely interested in joining his network, he might delay his planned attacks long enough for our coordinated resistance operation to proceed. Marcus might have inadvertently bought us the time we needed to eliminate the threat before it could eliminate us. I decided to play along with Marcus's apparent defection, but in a way that would maximize the intelligence value of the conversation while minimizing the damage to our actual plans. I pretended to be surprised but intrigued by Marcus's suggestion, and I asked Martinez to explain exactly what partnership would mean for our community. Martinez was clearly pleased by this development. He interpreted Marcus's intervention as evidence that our community's resistance was weakening and that I was losing control over my own people. He became more expansive in describing his plans and more specific about the terms he was offering. But as Martinez spoke, I noticed that his followers were becoming uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. They'd come expecting a confrontation or a clear rejection of their ultimatum. Instead, they were watching their leader negotiate with people they'd been told were enemies. Some of them were exchanging glances that suggested doubt about Martinez's judgment or strategy. I realized that Martinez's followers were experiencing the same kind of cognitive dissonance that I'd often seen in debtors who were being pressured to make payments they couldn't afford. They'd been told that our community represented a threat that needed to be eliminated, but now they were being told that we might be valuable allies. The contradiction was creating uncertainty about Martinez's leadership and the organization's priorities. That uncertainty gave me an opportunity to apply one of the most effective techniques I'd learned in debt collection. When someone is experiencing cognitive dissonance about their situation, they become more susceptible to alternative explanations that resolve the contradiction. If I could provide Martinez's followers with a different way of understanding their circumstances, I might be able to turn them against their leader. I began asking Martinez questions about his long-term strategy that were designed to highlight the contradictions in his approach. If his organization was successful in eliminating all resistance groups, what would prevent internal conflicts from tearing it apart? If his network continued to grow, how would he maintain the personal control that his system depended on? If his methods were so effective, why was he still facing resistance after 3 weeks of operations? Martinez tried to answer these questions, but his responses revealed the fundamental weaknesses in his approach. His system required constant expansion to generate the resources needed to maintain loyalty. It required external enemies to justify internal discipline. And it required his personal involvement in every major decision, which would become impossible as the organization grew larger. As Martinez struggled to explain how his system would work in the long term, his followers began to look skeptical. They joined his organization because it promised security and stability, but his answers suggested that it was inherently unstable and unsustainable. They were beginning to realize that they might have chosen the wrong side in the conflict between cooperation and exploitation. But the most important moment came when Marcus asked Martinez a question that exposed the personal motivation behind his entire operation. Marcus wanted to know why Martinez had chosen to build a predatory organization rather than a cooperative one, given that cooperation might be more sustainable in the long term. Martinez's answer revealed everything I needed to know about his psychology and his vulnerability. He explained that cooperation was a luxury that only worked when resources were abundant and threats were minimal. In a survival situation, he argued, people needed strong leadership and clear hierarchies. They needed to know that someone was making the hard decisions and taking responsibility for the consequences. But as Martinez spoke, his tone became more emotional and personal. He talked about the humiliation of being hunted by debt collectors, the shame of losing his business and his marriage, and the anger of being treated like a criminal for failing to pay debts he couldn't afford. He described his organization as a way of ensuring that he would never be powerless or vulnerable again. Martinez wasn't just building a survival organization. He was building a revenge fantasy that positioned him as the predator instead of the prey. His entire network was an elaborate psychological defense mechanism designed to protect him from ever feeling helpless or victimized again. And that psychological need was both the source of his strength and his greatest weakness. I realized that Martinez's followers were hearing this explanation for the first time, and that many of them were disturbed by it. They'd thought they were joining a practical survival organization, but they were actually supporting one man's personal therapy project. The revelation was undermining their confidence in Martinez's leadership and their commitment to his methods. That's when I made my move. I stood up and addressed Martinez's followers directly, ignoring Martinez himself and speaking to them as if he wasn't there. I explained that they had a choice to make about what kind of community they wanted to live in and what kind of person they wanted to be in this new world. I told them that they could continue following a leader whose primary motivation was personal. Revenge against a world that had treated him badly. They could spend their lives taking from others and living in constant fear of retaliation. They could build their security on other people's suffering and their prosperity on other people's losses. Or they could choose to build something better. They could join communities that were based on mutual aid and shared responsibility. They could use their skills and resources to help others survive, instead of exploiting their desperation. They could create a world where survival didn't require becoming a monster. As I spoke, I watched Martinez's followers closely for their reactions. Some remained loyal, but others were clearly wavering. The younger members seemed particularly affected by the moral arguments, while the older members were more concerned about practical considerations like long-term sustainability and personal safety. Martinez tried to regain control of the situation by interrupting my speech and demanding that his followers ignore what I was saying. But his reaction was too defensive and too emotional. He was proving my point about his psychological instability and his unsuitability for leadership. The harder he tried to maintain authority, the more he undermined his own credibility. 3 of Martinez's followers stood up and walked away from the group. They didn't say anything or make any dramatic gestures. They simply decided that they didn't want to be part of his organization anymore. Their quiet defection was more damaging to Martinez's authority than any argument I could have made. Marcus watched this development with intense interest, but his reaction wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of seeming pleased that our psychological operation was working, he seemed disappointed that Martinez was losing control so easily. Marcus had been studying Martinez as a potential teacher or mentor, and he was discovering that Martinez wasn't as skilled at psychological manipulation as he'd claimed to be. That's when I realized that Marcus's apparent betrayal might have been part of a more complex strategy. He hadn't been planning to join Martinez's organization. He'd been planning to take it over. Marcus had been studying both my methods and Martinez's methods because he wanted to build his own organization that combined the best aspects of both approaches. The meeting ended abruptly when Martinez realized that he was losing control of his own followers. He ordered the remaining members of his group to leave immediately, and he threatened retaliation against our community for what he called sabotage and betrayal. But his threats lacked conviction, and his followers' response lacked enthusiasm. As we walked back to our community, Marcus confirmed my suspicions about his real agenda. He explained that he'd never seriously considered betraying our group to join Martinez's organization. Instead, he'd been gathering intelligence about Martinez's methods and weaknesses while positioning himself to take advantage of any opportunities that arose. Marcus had realized that both our cooperative approach and Martinez's predatory approach had strengths and weaknesses. He thought that a hybrid model might be more effective than either pure strategy. He wanted to build an organization that used psychological manipulation to maintain internal discipline while presenting a cooperative face to external communities. I realized that Marcus had learned my lessons about human psychology too well. He understood that people could be manipulated into accepting almost any system if it was presented properly and if the alternative seemed worse. He was planning to use those insights to build an organization that would be more subtle and more effective than Martinez's crude approach. But Marcus had also learned something from watching Martinez's failure. He understood that successful manipulation required genuine competence and emotional stability. Martinez had failed because his personal psychology was too damaged and his methods were too obviously self-serving. Marcus was planning to avoid those mistakes by maintaining better emotional control and by genuinely delivering on his promises to followers. The next morning, our coordinated resistance operation proceeded as planned. Multiple communities throughout the region launched simultaneous attacks on predatory groups, using intelligence we'd gathered about their locations and capabilities. The operation was more successful than I'd dared to hope, eliminating most of the predatory network and scattering the survivors. Martinez's organization collapsed within hours of the attack on his warehouse complex. The psychological damage from our confrontation the previous evening had already undermined his authority, and the physical attack finished the job. Most of his followers either fled or surrendered, and Martinez himself disappeared during the fighting. But the success of our operation also revealed the extent of Marcus's planning and preparation. He had positioned himself to take control of the most valuable assets and personnel from Martinez's collapsed organization. He'd identified the most skilled and useful people and convinced them to join our community under his leadership rather than mine. By day 25, it was clear that Marcus had successfully executed a coup within our own community. He hadn't used violence or direct confrontation. Instead, he'd used the same psychological techniques I'd taught him to gradually shift loyalty and authority away from me and toward himself. He'd positioned himself as the natural leader for the new challenges we'd face in the post-Martinez world. I realized that I'd created my own replacement by teaching someone else to use the tools. That had made me effective. Marcus had learned not just my techniques for reading and influencing people, but my understanding of how to build and maintain authority within a group. He'd applied those lessons to his own situation with remarkable skill and patience. But Marcus had also learned something I hadn't intended to teach him. He'd learned that psychological manipulation could be used not just to protect a community or defeat external enemies, but to acquire power and control for its own sake. He'd discovered that understanding human nature gave him the ability to shape other people's choices and decisions in ways they might not even recognize. On day 30, I found myself in a position I'd never expected to be in. I was still a member of the community I'd helped build, but I was no longer its leader. Marcus had taken over that role through a combination of superior planning, better political skills, and more ruthless application of psychological manipulation techniques. The community was more successful than ever. We'd absorbed the most valuable members of Martinez's organization and established ourselves as the dominant group in the region. We'd built alliances with other survivor communities based on mutual aid and shared resources. We'd created a model that other groups were beginning to copy throughout the state. But I was no longer sure that our success was entirely positive. Marcus was using the same psychological techniques that Martinez had used, but he was applying them more skillfully and more subtly. He was building loyalty through genuine competence and real benefits rather than through fear and intimidation. But he was still manipulating people's choices and controlling their behavior for his own purposes. I realized that the crisis had changed all of us in ways we hadn't expected. The skills that had seemed necessary for survival had become tools for acquiring and maintaining power. The techniques that had protected us from external threats had become methods for controlling internal relationships. The knowledge that had saved our lives had also corrupted our values. The Ice Age wasn't just changing the climate and the landscape. It was changing human nature itself, or at least revealing aspects of human nature that civilization had kept hidden. The question wasn't whether we would survive the physical challenges of the new world. The question was whether we would survive them without becoming people we wouldn't have recognized before the crisis began. As I watched Marcus lead the community I'd helped create, using techniques I'd taught him to influence people I'd recruited, I realized that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying human. And in the 30 days since Yellowstone erupted, I'd learned that those two goals might be more difficult to achieve simultaneously than I'd ever imagined.